Welcome to Regenerative Life Hacks, where we give you shortcuts to create more meaning and significance in life and work. We offer stories with real people who bring change to their lives. We invite people to learn the hacks through the Regenerative Life Project, and then they tell us their story. Join us for the project and see what you can share with us. Stay tuned at the end of the show to learn how. I'm Max Zonizer, co host for Regenerative Life Hacks. And with me, as always, is Carol Sanford, our positive contrarian, who takes us on hard challenges, building capability to see to the essence of life situations and transform how we take them on. Hi, Carol. What are we chatting about today?
Hi, Max. Well, I have another fun subject. We're going to call it Can I Trust My Opinion of Myself? Can I trust how I know things? Or do I always need an outside expert to tell me? So, Max, how do you deal with knowing yourself?
Oh, it depends on the day. But hey, what expert can I find that can tell me how to do that, Carol?
Okay. Yeah. And you've just given thank you, an excellent explanation. Let me present a little more of what the hack is we're talking about today here, which is really developing intelligence. The idea of how we can know something and uh, who can, or whether we need authoritative sources is really core to the story we're going to need here to or look at here today with our guests. About 100 years ago, there was a new answer to this question, which was brought in by the creation of a discipline you probably heard of. It's called psychology. You probably don't know that the field of psychology is only 100 years old, and it was created specifically for you to trust experts and not yourself. So one of the first things that was introduced very early on was the idea that no one individual can see themselves. They don't have an inner life. They don't have consciousness. They can't see how they're thinking, what they're doing. They're blind to themselves, that only someone outside of them can tell them about themselves. And so there was a systematic campaign with parents, educators, business people, government people, and the military, and even the churches to have people believe that any understanding they had about themselves, about who they were, what they stood for, what their character was, how effective they were, almost any question you wanted to ask could not be determined by you asking them. So science switched from asking them about themselves because they call that introspection and said you only can have it happen from outside. So we got things like feedback because the psychologists of the day, the behavioralists, convince people that of this thing I just said, you can't see yourself. You have to have someone else tell you. And if you tell people that long enough, and you constantly give them an opinion that's different than they experience inside, pretty soon we lose the capacity for our own consciousness, our own self-reflection. And if you institutionalize that in every of all the five places or six if you had churches, you get all of it from an expert source, which can be everything from a scientist to mostly psychologists, was what they were sharing. And they argued that there should be a psychologist in every place. I got to experience one of the first putting of psychologists into schools and doing IQ tests. And if you want to know how I did, not very well. I was put in a class for people who were slow and had to be given extra help. I didn't feel that way, but after a while, I was pretty convinced. So, what we're working on in the Regenerative Paradigm Institute and in the groups that all the people in this call are connected to is moving from trusting expert knowledge and expert opinions of ourselves without examining them. And I don't mean debating them. I mean really genuinely understanding where in the world the ideas come from. We want to move from accepting other people's opinions depending on other people's opinions, trusting them over our own, to learning how to trust our own lived experience by reflecting on it. We're going to listen to a story today about someone who had their own learning discovery, and in learning to trust themselves through an intentional reflection, bringing consciousness, was able to genuinely question some things about what people thought was true and help them learn to do that, which is really the power. Where groups can decide how to read markets, they can learn how to read social justice systems, because we misinterpret them because we wait for others to tell us the answer. So, here today, our hack is developing intelligence, particularly for trusting a reflected lived experience. So, Max, who do we have with us today, and what are they going to talk to us about?
Yeah, thanks, Carol. Today we have Jeff Stack, who created an interesting change while leading a fellowship focused on civic leadership by using the regenerative educator role from your book. Welcome, Jeff.
Hey, Max. Hey, Carol.
Thank you for joining us. I appreciate it. Uh, it would be, I think, helpful if you would set up the scene here a little bit. You knew about this project because you're part of our change agent group, and you jumped in and had a situation in mind. So, why did you join the project first? Besides that, we offered it. What was your reason? And what was the project that you had in mind when you started? Because I know it evolved in terms of where the impact was. But give us a little context.
Sure. Well, thanks for the invitation to join you here today, and to join in this project. It was an amazing challenge, to both like hold the work that I was doing, that is so familiar and so ingrained in almost everything that I do and that we do as a culture, and then try on a different level and different way of thinking, and be able to hold that, at the same time. So it was a challenge, but an exciting one, um, to join in the project. And so when I joined the project, I was leading a fellowship, focused on civic leadership, and I would have 35 fellows over a 10-month period, and the fellows would come in one morning every month. We'd have our time together, and this fellowship was set up in a way where each month we'd bring in a different expert to talk about a different topic, whether that had to do with the city or with organizational development or with personal growth. And so it was my role to try to weave the threads throughout the entire fellowship, and to bring it all together. That was a tall challenge, just given the way that um, the the knowledge and the paradigms that each expert brought into the room was a bit different. So weaving that all together, in some coherent way, turned out to be a big challenge.
So it's if I'm interpreting this right, there was no real uh, opportunity or even invitation to question why all these were so different, or it was all like what I call flatland. And so you found yourself trying to kind of clean up the mess and build something. How did you see that you wanted to do it differently? Because I know you had a follow up opportunity to do with it, but what was it you changed in your mind that made you want to have knowledge transfer from a bucket of things, not be how you introduced it? What was your idea about going forward?
I could see the limitations, within the fellowship, and I could see, because I was involved in both the organizing of it, but then also, um, I was the one, who was in touch with each of the experts ahead of time, So I could start to see the paradigm and the thinking that they were coming into the room with. Um, and every session, I would try to like do a wrap up or do some sort of a yeah, some sort of a reflection, so that we would have some way to like find coherence throughout the entire experience for the fellows. But I found that to be incomplete. Um, and so there were a couple of things I think that changed through looking at these frameworks and looking at the work through the regenerative life process. I think the first was just a reliance on those experts for all the knowledge instead of a reliance on our own thinking and our own abilities. Um, a lot of what those experts would bring into the room, because this is what experts usually talk about, is like what to think
Hmm.
about. Um, instead of, and we hardly did, if anything, really. I would try to incorporate how we think about it, not just what to think about. Um, and then I think what I saw was, often it was the information offered by each of the experts was generic, right? Even though our 35 fellows came from very different contexts, very
Mm.
different organizations, the information was always given as the same information. Whereas in the capability that I have developed over time is to offer not generic information, but offer a shared framework that everyone can then work from in their own way. And so those were some of the changes I started to play with like throughout the process.
So that's great. You're giving, I think, a really good example here of what trusting your own lived experience means. You can't really do that, or you fall on automatic what you thought before they started. If you don't have a framework that makes you or offers you, invites you to discern what different ways you might hear through. So you can do what we've done in our first show, where you could look at which paradigm are they coming from. That's one of my favorite things to do. Listen to them and ask whether they're in kind of a self-centered extract value, whether they're trying to do less harm, whether they're doing good, whether they're maybe getting all the way to expressing essence. And if you do that, you get a much more powerful outcome. Now, I have another question for you that has to do with asking you to go back into doing the project and remembering, how did you get to that? What was the way you worked on the project, the way you reflected, the frameworks, the exercise, whatever you did that made you first even notice that the way you were presenting was an expert transfer to the idea of getting them to question? How did the project help you with that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I usually first had to just get myself in a mind where I could be ready to learn something new. That usually was the first step. Um, through engaging with the project, was offered a framework for the essence of the regenerative educator role. And through looking at that framework, this process for this regenerative educator role is one of developing intelligences. Um, and it really challenged me um, to really consider, like, wait, what are intelligences? What are the intelligences of the fellows that I'm working with? How would those be developed and not just fit into a box of kind of what the expert is bringing that day? Um, and so I started to think about the fellows and how I could be of higher service to them. Um, I've got to say though, the irony here is that the first time I really engaged with this framework, and most frameworks, I saw it from an expert epistemology. I would take your word for it. And it wasn't until I actually had to sit with it and try it within my own experience and within my own context that I finally started to be able to actually embody it in my own way. So this expert epistemology like shows up everywhere. It's like completely pervasive.
Even when we're trying to learn about it, we make the other person the expert. I know. Uh, so I think that the whole idea you're bringing for a hack here today is, remember, we have to work on not being the expert and making it difficult. I do all sorts of things to make it difficult. I write in semantic language. So people, if they're copying my words, it's easy to see because it sounds mechanical. And I do a lot of talking and asking people not to take notes. I don't invite people into our community. I find every way I can think of to have people not do what you said, but most people do, and we have to unlearn that. So, one of the ways you're pointing to is looking at the essence of one of the nine roles, and you looked at it from an educator and said, oh, it isn't about cramming in knowledge, it's about developing intelligence of the people that I am in service to, the fellows. So, one last quick question. What's been the value of being in that project for you longer term and maybe for the future?
Well, this has a couple of answers, but the first is really when I then went into my next job role, I was able to be far more effective as a leader and as a team leader and as a resource um, to my colleagues, um, because I wasn't trying to tell them what to do. Or I would almost on the same basis that we would do the fellowship. So on about a monthly basis, we would actually spend time together and spend a morning together, and I would present. I would help them experience a framework. I would present that framework, and then we would reflect on it and talk about how that applies to our work together. And even though those fellows were always using something from their own context, from their own work, or from their own life, I actually didn't care what they brought, what they
Right.
were thinking about, as long as it was something meaningful to them. And what that did is it allowed us to become a really effective team and to be able to work together because we started to have a shared understanding of the work, the how we could work effectively together, and a shared language around that. So it's been valuable to me in a work context, and it's also been valuable to me in just in making life decisions and continuing to challenge my own trajectory, and my own trust of myself. Uh, I ended up I ended up deciding to take on a dream I've always wanted to do, and that was bicycle across the country. And I did that last year,
Right.
and it took an immense amount of trust in myself, almost almost on a daily basis, to make those decisions and to make that meta decision to take that risk. But then on a day-to-day basis, how to consider consider both the context and what was going on for me, and decide how to proceed. And having this type of thinking available um, helped me through that process, and both have a good time and stay safe.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you joining me today, Geoff. Stand by for a moment because we're going to bring Max back in, who has a question from a listener, and he can explain to people how that ask a question works. And then you and I can try and reflect on it, starting with Geoff. Max?
Yeah, that was, I just want to say that was great, Geoff. Thanks for those stories. So every show we take questions from our audience, what they want to reconcile in their own lives, hopefully closely related to the topic at hand. So if folks out there watching this have questions for any of us around the regenerative roles in Carol's book, The Regenerative Life, put them in the comments and we may pick your question for the next show. And then our guests will take a run at the questions we select, and then Carol may add her own responses. So we got the following question from an audience member. I fall into being an expert role when trying to teach. My students ask me to be an expert. It comforts them. How do you manage that? Geoff, you want to take a crack at that first?
I'll give it a go, but I'm no expert on this. And I would even think about like, I mean, um, I can think back to a little bit of teaching that I've done with students and source that experience. We would have there's the option of always like I would take the kids through the woods, and I could stand at a tree or stand in a place and do what we call the dragon brag, and just tell them all the things that it'd be very comforting to them and to me if I just like rattled it all off and all the facts that they needed to know. But instead, it's far more dynamic and far more exciting for me and for them, far more unpredictable. But to actually set up an experience where they could experience not just that tree, but the forest and all of the interactions that that tree and they are having in the forest at that time. And that to me is like far closer to um, actually developing intelligence and developing knowledge and developing the love of a place and a subject. So I think that's maybe how I would start with that. What do you think, Carol?
Well, I think you're right. And there's not only nature can be experienced and be used. You can ask, I do every opening I have with an exercise that I tell people to pick something that they like to think about regard to the subject I'm about to work on. And then I ask them to develop their own thinking about how they got there, how they're thinking about it. Then when I do introduce ideas, they're holding in mind with their own experience, and they're less likely to fall into doing what you said earlier, which is seeing me as an expert. There's another thing that's actually my favorite thing to do in a classroom, and that can be a corporate classroom, a university classroom, or a group of parents, which is I start with telling them, you should not trust me. I don't say I'm not an expert. I say, you should not trust me. I don't know more about you than you know about you. You shouldn't adopt anything I say without testing it with your own life experience through a reflective framework, nor should you reject anything I say without testing it with your own personal experience through a framework. So I think if you keep letting people, if you begin by sounding like you're in charge, people will immediately switch to, to expert. If you sound like, well, if you say to them, don't trust me, for students, especially university ones, I become their best friend because they already wanted to do that, but they didn't know how. So then we talk about how to do that. So, Max, how did we do? How do we do? Do you think we spoke to the question? And
Yeah, absolutely. That you both did a great job in my estimation of answering that. It resonates a great deal with my own experience in finding ways to not teach, frankly, as a teacher. Um, so yeah, thank you both. Thanks, Geoff, as our guest today. As with all our guests, Geoff joined the Regenerative Life Project just by buying 5 copies of the Regenerative Life, sending the receipt in, and we let you into the project to take on this challenge with the Regenerative Life self-directed mini course. Then we jointly consider, after completing one project situation, the guest stories that are provided. And if you're on the show, we will give you a free pass to our global virtual summit this fall. And thanks to everyone out there on the interwebs for joining us for this episode. Please hit the like button if you got anything out of this, and also consider subscribing and hitting that bell icon so you get notified whenever we add more episodes. High fives, Geoff and Carol. Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.